It was supposed to be the performance of their lives. 18 voices, bound for state finals, a high school choir on the brink of greatness. But they vanished without a trace. No calls, no wreckage, no survivors, just silence. For 20 years the town of Harrowbrook whispered of the choir, haunted by the memory of what was lost. But the mystery was buried beneath layers of time. Until one summer morning, a farmer clearing land stumbled upon something that would reignite the case. The rusted shell of a white church van, swallowed by moss, filled with eerie remnants, and what he found inside was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The small town of Harrowbrook was the type of place where everyone knew everyone. The high school, perched on a hill overlooking the main street, was the town's pride. It wasn't just about academics or sports, it was about community. And at the heart of that community was the Harrowbrook High School Choir. Year after year, this group of talented students had represented their town in the state finals, earning the respect and admiration of the entire town. The spring of 2003 was no different. The choir, made up of 18 talented seniors, had spent months preparing for the state finals, and their final performance was expected to be nothing short of spectacular. For these students, this trip would be their last hurrah before they went their separate ways, stepping into the future. But something about this trip felt different. There was an unease in the air that no one could quite explain.
The choir, key characters. Lena Harris. Age, 18. Role, choir leader, soloist. Personality, Lena had always been the choir's shining star. She was smart, driven, and a natural leader. As the choir's lead soprano, she had carried the group through the most difficult songs. But Lena had always felt the weight of her father's expectations. Her father, Pastor Richard Harris, was a figure of authority in the town, and Lena was expected to live up to the perfection that he, and the town, demanded. Her future was mapped out: Harvard, a music career, but she often found herself wondering if she could bear the burden of it all. Marcus Green. Age, 17. Role, tenor, Lena's closest friend. Personality, Marcus was the choir's charismatic performer, the one who could get everyone to laugh and feel at ease. But behind his easygoing exterior, Marcus struggled with the same pressures of expectation. His family wanted him to follow a more practical path, a future that didn't include music. Recently, Marcus had begun to withdraw, haunted by a secret he couldn't share, a complicated relationship with one of the teachers at the school that he feared would ruin his future if it ever came to light. Nina Caldwell. Age, 16. Role, alto, the artistic soul. Personality, Nina was the quiet one, always with a sketchbook in hand and lost in her thoughts. While the rest of the choir was focused on the competition, Nina spent her time dreaming, and her dreams weren't always pleasant. Recently, she'd been having strange visions of forests, dark figures, and disembodied voices. Though most of the others dismissed it as stress, Lena had noticed Nina's behavior becoming more disturbed, and she couldn't help but feel that the visions were somehow tied to the strange feeling that lingered in the air.
The evening of May 28, 2003, was the last chance for the choir to perfect their performance before they departed. The auditorium was filled with music as the choir rehearsed their final piece, a stirring rendition of Ode to Joy. Their voices soared, their harmonies flawless, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect. But something was off. As the choir wrapped up their final practice, Lena stood in front of the group, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel the unease in the air. Marcus's usual lightheartedness had faded. Nina's sketches were left abandoned on her desk, and the weight of the trip seemed to hang over them all. She tried to shake it off, focusing on the music, but she couldn't help but notice the quiet whispers that seemed to follow her. After rehearsal, the choir gathered in the cafeteria to celebrate. It should have been a moment of joy, but there was an undercurrent of tension. As they talked about the upcoming trip, Lena felt a deep sense of foreboding creeping in. The feeling grew stronger when she overheard a conversation between two of the teachers. They were talking about the substitute driver, Mr. Carl Burns, who would be taking the group to the state finals. The original driver, an elderly man who had driven the choir on past trips, was suddenly unable to make it due to a last-minute emergency. Mr. Burns, A quiet man with no previous connection to the choir had been asked to step in. Lena felt an uneasy chill as she realized they were being driven by someone they didn't know, someone who didn't have the same familiarity with the students or the road. But when she mentioned this to Marcus, he simply shrugged it off. "It's just a van ride, Lena. We'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen?" But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the unfamiliarity of the situation was setting something in motion, something dark and unexplainable.
The next morning, on May 29, 2003, the choir gathered to leave. The white church van was parked in front of the high school, its engine running, ready to take the students to the Rogue River Wilderness for the finals. The town had gathered to see them off, with parents, teachers, and friends standing in the parking lot. There were hugs, goodbyes, and a few final words of encouragement. Lena hugged her mother tightly. "Stay true to yourself, Lena," her mother said, her voice filled with pride and love. Pastor Harris gave Lena a nod of approval, his face serious as he told her to be safe, but his eyes lingering with a look that Lena couldn't quite place. As the van pulled out of the parking lot, the choir sang their last song together, their voices ringing out as the familiar sights of Harrowbrook faded in the rearview mirror. But as they drove deeper into the mountains and the road became narrower, Lena began to feel a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the new driver, but something about the isolation of the road. The trees grew taller, the fog rolled in faster, and the air became inexplicably colder. By the time they reached the Rogue River Wilderness, the weather had turned sour. The once clear skies were now filled with thick clouds, and the wind had picked up, rustling the trees ominously. Marcus and Nina exchanged glances in the back of the van, their faces tinged with the same unease Lena felt but couldn't voice.
Just after 6 p.m., the choir's van sputtered to a halt. The engine stuttered and died, leaving the group stranded on the side of a narrow, winding road. The silence that followed was unnerving. No cars passing by, no sound except the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The students got out to stretch their legs, but the foreboding atmosphere in the air made it hard to relax. The sound of the wind seemed louder now, as if the forest itself was alive, watching them. Mr. Burns, the substitute driver, fiddled with the engine, trying to get it started, but to no avail. There was no phone signal, no way to contact anyone. The road stretched on in both directions, empty and isolated. Lena took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "It's just a van issue. We'll be fine," she reassured herself. But the unease she had felt for days was now a knowing certainty. They weren't just stranded. They were trapped, and the road ahead might lead them somewhere they could never return from. By the time the sunset faded into night, the choir's van had yet to start. Mr. Burns, the substitute driver, had been working on the engine for over an hour. The students, growing restless, began to wander off the road and into the dense forest around them. The air felt heavy, the forest seemingly closing in on them. Some students joked, while others nervously glanced at the horizon, where the fog had begun to roll in thicker than before. Lena stood by the van, trying to keep the group together, but her mind raced. There was no signal on their phones. The road was quiet, no passing cars, no lights in the distance. She turned to Mr. Burns, hoping he had figured out the problem. His face was shadowed in the low light, his movements slow and deliberate. Suddenly, a loud snap from the underbrush startled them all. It was the sound of something large breaking branches, but nothing emerged from the trees. "It's just an animal," Marcus said, forcing a smile to mask his own growing discomfort. But the sound was unsettling, the way it echoed through the woods, as if the forest itself had been disturbed. By 10 p.m., the group was still stranded. Mr. Burns was now suggesting they camp overnight until the van could be repaired. Lena, though increasingly nervous, agreed, her leadership instincts taking over. They unloaded their bags from the van and set up makeshift campsites along the road. The atmosphere grew heavier by the minute, and the quiet of the wilderness began to feel suffocating. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and then the first scream broke the silence. It came from the edge of the forest, distant but unmistakable. A cry for help. Lena's heart skipped. She immediately ran toward the sound, only to be stopped by Marcus grabbing her arm. "It's just a deer, Lena. There's nothing out there." But the scream came again, this time closer, more frantic. "Hannah!" called out, but there was no reply. The screams continued, echoing in the night. And then it stopped, complete silence. It was as if something had interfered with their very connection to the world around them. By morning, they were gone. Back in Harrowbrook, the town was in a frenzy when news of the disappearance broke. The police launched a search operation immediately, but the clues were almost non-existent. No wreckage, no tire marks, and no sign of the group on the road. The police theorized that the van had broken down and that the students, panicked or confused, might have wandered off into the woods. Yet, after several days of combing the dense Rogue River wilderness, nothing turned up. No bodies, no footprints. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The town was left to wonder. What happened to them? Theories ranged from wild animal attacks to a cult kidnapping the group, but no one could explain the lack of evidence. Harrowbrook was left with only one thing to cling to: the urban legend of the vanished choir. The investigation was eventually called off, with authorities unable to find any further leads. It was as though the choir had never existed. Years passed, and the case slowly faded into the background of Harrowbrook's history, becoming a story that mothers told their children. The choir that disappeared. A chilling, unexplained mystery whispered over campfires. But in the summer of 2023, a farmer named John Matthews was about to unknowingly bring the case back to life. John was clearing land on his property near the Rogue River wilderness, planning to plant a new crop of apples. As he dug into the ground, his shovel struck something solid, metal. At first he thought it was an old barrel, but when he uncovered the object, his heart dropped. It was the van. The same white church van that the choir had taken. It was rusted and half buried in the soil, as though it had been swallowed by the earth itself. But the sight was unnerving. This wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. It was a frozen scene left to rot in the wilderness. John quickly alerted the authorities, and soon a team of forensic experts arrived to examine the site. As they opened the van's doors, a wave of unease washed over everyone. The interior was eerily preserved, as if time had stood still inside the van. Backpacks, personal belongings, and even yearbooks were scattered across the seats. But then they found something that no one was prepared for. 13 bodies, skeletons dressed in the choir's uniforms, their eyes wide open in frozen horror. The bodies were arranged carefully, seated as if the choir had been on their way to perform. Among the eerie remnants, a cassette tape was discovered, wedged inside the van's old radio. When forensic experts played it, the haunting sound of a choir singing filled the air. But the voices were not the choir's. A deep, strange chanting voice joined the song, in a language no one could recognize. The recording was cut off abruptly, with knocking sounds that seemed to come from within the van itself. The entire scene was more than unsettling. It was unnatural, as though something had been disturbed, something beyond their understanding. The discovery reopened the case, but it only raised more questions. Why were there only 13 bodies when 18 had disappeared? Why was the van so far from the original road? And what was the significance of the mysterious chanting on the tape? In the weeks following the discovery, the town of Harrowbrook found itself once again haunted by the story of the vanished choir. The legend was no longer a tale to be whispered at night. It had become a real horror, one that could never be erased. The community now found itself questioning everything. Was the choir's disappearance truly an accident? Or was there something far more sinister at play? Weeks passed after the discovery of the van, but the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. No new leads, no answers, just more questions. It wasn't until a local historian, Dr. Samuel Hawthorne, uncovered an old, nearly forgotten journal from the early 2000s that something new came to light. Dr. Hawthorne had been researching the town's history, but his findings would change the course of the investigation. The journal belonged to Reverend Alan Bishop, a former town figure and the leader of the now-dissolved religious group known as the Shepherd's Flock. In the pages, Hawthorne uncovered disturbing entries. One particular passage stood out. "The choir is the key. They are to be the chosen vessels, the final link between the living and the beyond. Their voices, if heard correctly, will guide the lost to eternal peace. The journal contained more references to sacrifices and rituals that had been performed by the shepherd's flock in the years leading up to the choir's disappearance. It wasn't just a religious group. It was a cult, one that believed in bringing about spiritual transcendence through extreme rituals. They'd been drawn to the choir because of its purity, its harmonic unity, and its potential to transcend life and death. Dr. Hawthorne's discovery led to a breakthrough. The tape found in the van wasn't just a song. It was an invocation, a ritualistic chant meant to summon a spiritual force. The voices on the tape, the chanting that had been haunting the investigation, were not just disembodied sounds. They were voices of the choir, but distorted, manipulated. The cult had twisted their voices to guide them through an unholy ritual. As the evidence piled up, something far more sinister began to unfold. The vanishing of the choir wasn't an accident. It was planned, orchestrated by those who believed they could trap souls and bind them to the earth. But the rituals went wrong. The cult's attempt to transcend was interrupted. Some of the choir members had resisted, fought back, and were sacrificed. Others, perhaps the ones who were most willing, were chosen to become part of the ritual. What happened next was something that no one could have prepared for. Lena, the choir's leader, was the key. It was her voice, the one that had led the choir, that the cult believed would guide them to eternal peace. But something went terribly wrong when the ritual tried to reach its climax. The force they had called upon was too powerful to control. It didn't just trap the souls of the choir, it changed them, twisted them into something else. The final tape, the one that was discovered in the van, was an unfinished performance, the choir's last song, distorted and corrupted. The voices were still singing, but their song was no longer a hymn. It had become something darker, a call to the beyond, a summons to forces that should never be disturbed. And then, something that chilled everyone to the core happened. A surviving member of the choir emerged from the woods. Just when the investigation seemed to be running out of leads, Marcus Green, the choir's former tenor, walked into a police station late one evening. His eyes were wide with fear and confusion. His hair had grown long, his clothes tattered, but his voice remained unmistakable. He had been missing for 20 years, thought to be dead just like the others. But he had returned. The police and investigators were stunned. Marcus was incoherent at first, but as they carefully pieced together his story, a terrifying truth began to emerge. Marcus described waking up in the forest, surrounded by the bodies of his friends. But they weren't just dead, they were trapped, forever in the forest, their voices echoing in the trees. He had managed to escape, but the horror he had witnessed would stay with him forever. "They're still there," Marcus said, shaking his head. "The choir, they never left. They're still singing, waiting for us to finish their song." The investigators, following Marcus's lead, ventured into the forest near the Rogue River wilderness. What they found there was nothing short of terrifying. They walked deeper into the woods, following the faint sounds of the choir's music that seemed to hang in the air like a haunting echo. The song was familiar, but twisted, like it was being sung through a veil of distortion. It was the same hymn, but this time, the voices sounded otherworldly, as if they were coming from a place beyond the living. And then they saw it, the empty seats, the clearing where the van had been found, now silent. But as they walked deeper into the forest, something stopped them. A shimmering light appeared ahead, flickering through the trees. It was the same song, but now it was clearer. The trees seemed to bend toward it, as if drawn by an unseen force. Marcus's voice trembled as he whispered, "It's not over. They're still waiting. And if we don't finish their song, we'll never leave." The investigators moved cautiously toward the clearing, the music growing louder, more intense. The voices of the missing choir filled the air, their harmonies becoming chaotic, wild. The sound reverberated through the trees, and it felt as though the forest itself was alive with the spirits of the choir. And then the voices stopped. the clearing fell into complete silence. The investigators stood frozen, staring at the space where the choir had once been. The vanishing was no longer a mystery. The choir's song had been their curse, their eternal prison, a prison that could never be escaped. The forest had claimed them, their voices now lost to the wind. As the investigation reached its chilling conclusion, the town of Harrowbrook was left to pick up the pieces. The choir's disappearance had been more than just a case. It had been a trap, a sacrifice, and a spiritual anomaly that no one could fully comprehend. Marcus Green, the only survivor, could never truly escape. His mind remained haunted by the song, the voices of his friends forever etched into his soul, and as the years passed, the town slowly returned to normal. But the whispers of the vanished choir would never fade. Every year, the anniversary of their disappearance was marked with a quiet memorial, but the song, the final hymn, could still be heard in the wind. A reminder that the vanished choir was never truly gone. The song never ends. After the terrifying discovery in the forest, Harrowbrook was never the same. The investigators were left with more questions than answers. The tape, the ritualistic arrangement of the bodies, and the forest that seemed to breathe everything pointed to something beyond human comprehension. In the weeks following Marcus's return, the town was divided. Some believed the choir had been part of some unspeakable ritual, but others couldn't accept the idea that their loved ones had been sacrificed. The cult theory lingered in the air, unanswered. But as the weeks wore on, something even more unsettling happened. Strange disappearances began to occur. People claimed to hear whispers in the woods at night. The faint, distorted hymn of the choir could still be heard in the wind. And some townspeople swore they saw shadowy figures standing by the tree line, just beyond the reach of the road. A legend of the vanished choir had evolved into a living nightmare, one that continued to haunt Harrowbrook. The authorities decided to close the case, but the weight of the unsolved mystery never truly left the town. Marcus, the last survivor, became a recluse. He no longer spoke of what happened that night, but his eyes told a different story, a story of trapped souls, a song that could never be silenced. Every night, he could hear it just as the rest of the town could, the final hymn of the choir, calling out from the darkened woods. Some say that Marcus Green left Harrowbrook seeking peace, but others claim he never truly left the town. His ghost and the voices of the choir are said to haunt the area to this day. The woods still whisper, waiting for someone to answer the call to finish the song. As the years passed, Harrowbrook moved forward, but a vanished choir remained forever etched in the town's memory. The legacy of the choir's disappearance was sealed. Every year, the anniversary of the disappearance was marked with a quiet memorial service where the townspeople would gather to light 27 candles, one for each member of the choir. But in the background, the song never stopped. The whispers in the woods, the strange sensation of being watched, and the melody in the wind reminded everyone that some mysteries were not meant to be solved. They were meant to linger, waiting to reveal themselves in moments of vulnerability. Before we close this haunting chapter, we invite you to reflect. What do you think really happened to the vanished choir? Was it a cult ritual? A supernatural occurrence? Or is there another layer to this mystery that no one has uncovered yet? The song of the vanished choir will never end, but will you be the one to uncover the truth? If you feel brave enough, we encourage you to explore the forests of Harrowbrook. Search the edges of the woods and listen for the faint hum of the final hymn. Like, share, and comment below with your theories on what happened to the choir. Could the voices still be calling? Could the song ever truly be finished? And as always, stay tuned for more chilling true crime stories, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved.